Good afternoon. Everybody ready to start back? Welcome to our second plenary session of the National League for Nursing's 2014 Educational Summit. Today we're going to talk about the National Council's National Simulation Research Study results. Yesterday afternoon, Bev spoke with us about the NLN's purpose, power, and passion. And just this morning, Lee Cockrell added to the discussion of power and passion, helping us to see the power of personal leadership and the passion in moving from good to great. This afternoon session will continue the dialogue. We will hear about the landmark National Council study, which challenges us to question current assumptions about clinical teaching and expand our understanding of how program outcomes can be accomplished with simulation. There is power in data, and our passion to provide a safe, quality practice environment for patients will lead us, I'm sure, to thoughtful discussions about with our faculty about what the findings mean for us and how those findings will influence the ways that we conceptualize our work with students. At this moment, I would like to acknowledge the Indiana University School of Nursing for sponsoring this session. Boy, this orange dress really looks bright, doesn't it? Okay. I'm glad I'm looking this way. It is now my pleasure and my privilege to formally introduce Dr. Mary Ann Alexander. In her capacity as Chief Officer, Nursing Regulation at the National Council, Dr. Alexander oversees all activities related to research, education, practice, licensure, and discipline. She is also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Nursing Regulation, a role she loves based on her passion for dissemination of data and research findings related to the triad of practice, education, and regulation. Prior to her tenure at the National Council, she served as the executive director of the Illinois Board of Nursing. Dr. Alexander was also a clinical nurse specialist at Rush University Medical Center, where she held a faculty appointment as an assistant professor in the College of Nursing. Dr. Alexander received her master's degree in nursing from Northwestern University and her PhD in health policy from the University of Illinois. She has authored articles and book chapters, has won several research awards, was the recipient of a National Institutes of Health policy internship, and has given numerous presentations locally, nationally, and internationally. We are thrilled that Dr. Alexander is with us today. And as we had said earlier, Jennifer Hayden, who was the PI on the project, was scheduled to be here, but at the last minute could not attend. I know that we are in for a very exciting discussion of the study of the results, and Dr. Alexander will take questions at the end of her presentation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mary Ann Alexander.
Well, good afternoon. It is my pleasure to be here today to bring you the results of our study that began in 2010. Let me tell you a little bit about the history of this study. In the years prior, You might remember that simulation centers were increasing across the country, and clinical placement sites were decreasing. And regulators, as well as educators, had questions. Can possibly simulation be used as a substitute for traditional clinical hours? If so, how many and in what courses? To answer these questions, NCSBN embarked upon the largest, most comprehensive study to date, examining the use of simulation in the pre-licensure nursing curriculum. Well, let me tell you about the state of the science when we embarked upon this project. We looked at the literature, and although there were a lot of studies, and some of them were well done, they were all very small sample sizes. Many did not have a control group. Many were not randomized. There was a lot of variability in study designs, and there were no longitudinal studies. Our aim was to fill the gap in the literature. So, to answer questions such as, can simulation be effectively substituted in the undergraduate pre-licensure curriculum? How much? What courses? We wanted generalizable results so regulators and educators could make policy decisions. We knew the study had to be big, broad, comprehensive, and rigorous. Let me begin with our first research question. The first one was, does substituting clinical hours with 25% and 50% simulation impact educational outcomes? And those we studied were knowledge, clinical competency, critical thinking, and readiness for practice when assessed at the end of the undergraduate nursing program. The second question, are there course-by-course differences in nursing knowledge, clinical competency, and perception of learning needs being met among undergraduate students when traditional clinical hours are substituted with 25% and 50% simulation? Our third question was, are there differences in first-time NCLEX pass rates between students that were randomized into a control group, 25% and 50% of traditional clinical substituted with simulation? And being NCSBN, you know we had to bring the NCLEX in there. We also had a second part to the study, and I'm going to repeat these questions later to jog your memory, but let me just tell you what they are right now. We also followed the students that were enrolled in this study into their first 6 months of practice as an RN. And so we asked, are there differences in those same variables that we looked at, clinical competency, critical thinking, and readiness for practice among the new graduate nurses from the 3 study groups? And are there differences among new graduates from the 3 study groups in acclimation to the role of the professional nurse? Our research design. This was a randomized, controlled, large-scale, multi-site longitudinal study. There were 10 sites that participated in the study. These were 10 nursing programs. In 2010, a national call went out. We sent a card to notification to every school in this country and offered the opportunity to apply for participation in the study. Inclusion criteria for the programs to be considered was they needed to be Board of Nursing approved programs. They needed national accreditation. Their NCLEX pass rates had to be at or above the national pass rate. They had to have a simulation lab that met the criteria for the study. They had to be willing to have their students randomized into the 3 groups, and they had to be willing to have a dedicated study team and follow the study protocol for 2 years. 10 programs were selected, 5 BSN and 5 ADN programs. And the BSN were the upper division programs with nursing courses that started at their junior year. In the fall of 2011, students enrolling in those 10 nursing programs were eligible to participate in the study. The inclusion criteria for students were they had to be enrolled in the fall of 2011 and they had to graduate in the spring of 2013. The exclusion criteria were that we did not want accelerated BSN students because we wanted more of a comparable sample where students were all comparable coming in without other education and not accelerating through the program. We did not want degree completion or any student holding a nursing license. Students were randomized into one of 3 groups, and these students at each school, each nursing program, had all 3 groups. So in each program, we randomized their students into one of these 3 groups. So the control group had traditional clinical experiences. They could use up to 10% simulation, and we allowed that because most schools were doing at least that. The 25% group, 25% of their time would be spent in simulation, and 75% would be spent in traditional clinical experiences. And in the 50% group, 50% of their traditional clinical time would be substituted with simulation. The students would be in these groups for all their core nursing courses, which included the fundamentals of nursing, medical surgical nursing, for the schools that had it, advanced medical surgical nursing, maternal newborn nursing, pediatrics, mental health, and community health nursing. The instruments that we used to collect the data were as follows. To measure nursing knowledge, we used the ATI Content Mastery Series for course-by-course test scores, as well as the end of program test results. Clinical competency was measured with the Creighton Competency Evaluation Instrument. This was adapted for both simulation and traditional clinical experience, so the same instrument was used, and all faculty that did these ratings underwent very specific training on how to use the instrument. The new Graduate Nurse Performance Survey was put out by the Nursing Executive Center of the Advisory Board Company, and the global assessment of clinical competency and readiness for practice was really one question taken from a tool that NCSBN used and tested, and all of the instruments used in these were psychometrically sound. If we had any question or we didn't have enough data or we adapted the tool, we did our own testing to ensure their reliability and validity. We assessed how the students' learning needs were met using the Clinical Learning Environment Comparison Survey by Kathy Layton. Critical thinking was assessed using the Critical Thinking Diagnostic, again put out by the Nursing Executive Center of the Advisory Board Company. And the acclimation to the role of the RN was developed by NCSBN, and this was really a collection of numerical data. The framework for simulation can be done in many ways. We use the NLN Jeffries simulation framework. A variety of methods were employed in the simulation study. So schools had a variety of opportunities to employ simulation, from using high fidelity and medium fidelity mannequins to standardized patients, role-playing, computer-based critical thinking simulations, and skill stations. Schools were allowed to be flexible as to how they wanted to designate the 25 and 50% simulation. But on a typical day, an entire clinical group reported to the sim lab with a clinical instructor, and that clinical instructor was also the same clinical instructor that they had in their traditional clinical experience. 2 students were assigned to the nursing roles, and in those roles, they were evaluated by their clinical instructor on the Creighton Clinical Competency Evaluation Instrument. A standardized curriculum was used throughout the study that was developed using the Delphi method. And the purpose to that was to develop a curriculum of what should be in the undergraduate pre-licensure nursing curriculum. And just briefly to tell you about this process, a survey was initially sent to experts in nursing and simulation. Over 1,000 topics were recommended that needed to be covered. The list was narrowed by the study teams that participated in the study. And then as that list was narrowed down by various groups, the schools had the ability to pick and choose specific topics and scenarios that they wanted. And we felt this was very important, that they have some control, and it helped with their buy-in in the study. Extensive training of the study teams took place 3 weekends. The study teams met for intensive training so that everybody was, all simulation was taking place in the same way. The study teams learned how to facilitate simulations, how to debrief, and how to use the data collection forms. Simulation scenarios were obtained from publishers and distributed to the programs. If we felt that there was scenarios lacking, we received them from an ASCL, and also there were some of the schools had scenarios, and those were evaluated by experts to make sure they met the NLN Jeffries framework and our criteria. Schools also received mannequin programming files and consumable supplies. And I have to tell you about Jennifer Hayton's office that our CEO passed one day and said, "Why is Jennifer's office turned into a pharmacy?" But just about looked like Walgreens. She had so many different drugs and supplies there. We sent those out to the schools for their use. The second and third training meetings were held in sim centers, and I have to tell you, we actually brought students in, so faculty that were learning had worked actually with students, and this faculty were competency tested, especially on their debriefing methods, to ensure everybody understood the methodology and everybody was doing them, going to be conducting them the same way. IRB approval was obtained from the Western IRB for NCSBN, and each school also went through its own IRB process. We also established a data safety monitoring board to review all data each semester to ensure the study was not putting any of the groups at risk. And that group consisted of 2 statisticians, 2 pre-licensure nursing program directors that were not involved in the study, and NCSBN staff. Well, let me get to the results of the study. Let me first tell you about our sample demographics. We began the study with 847 undergraduate nursing students. 666 completed the study. And if you look at the column under completed study, you see that we're a fairly equal group, equal number of students in each of the 3 groups. And the sample looked like a typical undergraduate nursing class. 86% were female, 84% were white. The average age was 26 years old, and about 16% had experience as a nursing assistant. Just to give you a little bit of idea about attrition, the rate of completion in the program, this is where there's one statistical significant difference. The 50% group had a higher level of withdrawal from the study than did the control group or the 25% group. But if you look at the rate of failure, they had the least number of failures. However, it might be because those students dropped out before they failed. So going back to remind you of our first research question, does substituting clinical hours with 25% and 50% simulation impact educational outcomes assessed at the end of the undergraduate nursing program. Our knowledge assessment, these are the mean scores at the end of the program ATI Comprehensive Predictor. These are the mean total scores of all three groups. And as you can see, they are very close, and these scores were not statistically significant. There's literally 1% or less difference between these groups. For clinical competency, these are the end of program preceptor ratings. So in the capstone course or the last clinical course of the nursing program, their preceptor or clinical instructor rated them using the new graduate nurse performance survey. The survey, you can see, has a variety of elements that they evaluated the student on. Student was evaluated on a 1 to 6 scale, 1 being the lowest score they could receive, and 6 being the highest rating. There is no statistically significant difference on any of these measures, and all students received a rating greater than 5. In critical thinking, at the end of the program, preceptor or clinical instructor ratings. On the critical thinking diagnostic 1 to 6 scale, again, all three groups were rated extremely high, above 5 on a 1 to 6 scale, and there is no statistically significant difference. The overall clinical competency, the end of the program, preceptor or clinical instructor ratings. This was using the global assessment of clinical competency and readiness for practice. The instructor or preceptor was asked to rate them, how ready they were to enter professional practice, with 1 being the lowest rating, one of the least prepared that instructor or preceptor had ever observed, 210 being the highest. And again, there is no statistically significant difference between these groups, and all of them received a mean rating of 8.2 or higher. Research question number 2 was, are there course-by-course differences in nursing knowledge, clinical competency, and the perception of nursing needs being met among undergraduate students when traditional clinical hours are substituted with 25% and 50% simulation? And I'm going to run through these courses pretty quickly because you're going to start to see a bit of a trend. In the fundamentals of nursing, ATI knowledge assessment, the mean total scores were almost identical, and there was no statistical difference. In the fundamentals of nursing, their clinical competency scores, they were scored on a weekly basis by their clinical instructor. And here you can see in the first course, maybe the 50% group started out a little bit lower, but they soon got up to speed. And at the end, there was no statistically significant difference between the three groups. In med-surg nursing, and I'm going to put aside the ATI scores for just a minute, because the ATI does not have a test for advanced med-surgical nursing. So for those schools that offered that course, we allowed the students to take the ATI at the end of that course. Otherwise, it was taken at the end of their regular medical surgical nursing course. But here you can see their scores in the clinical environment. All three groups ended up identical, and again, there was no statistical significant difference. On their knowledge assessment, there was a statistical significant difference with the 50% group scoring higher than the control group. However, this is less than a 3% difference and may not have any practical significance. The advanced medical surgical nursing clinical competency, as you can see, once again, all three groups were practically identical throughout all the weeks of the course, and there was no statistical difference. Maternal newborn nursing, again, the 50% group was statistically higher especially when compared with the control group. But again, the scores are still very similar. We're comparing 68.4% with 71.1%, probably not an observable difference between those groups. Maternal newborn nursing and clinical competency. Some variation here. We actually looked at one of the schools that might have caused that variation with the 50% group, and they said they had just a really tough instructor for that course. But there was still no statistical difference between the groups. In pediatric nursing, again, the 50% group had a statistically significantly higher test score, but again, the range for all three groups is very close and probably not of a lot of practical significance. Pediatric nursing, their clinical competency, no difference, no statistical differences. Mental health nursing, again, the 50% group scored the highest, and it was statistically significant. In mental health nursing, clinical competency, there was no statistically significant difference among the three groups. In community health nursing, not all schools offered this course. Some had it interwoven within other courses. So the N here was a little bit smaller, but again, there was no difference among the groups on their ATI assessment, mean total scores, and the same for their clinical competency in the clinical setting. Now let's look at the learning needs that the students set. These were student ratings. They were asked how well their learning needs were met. And this question was asked at the end of the program. That's what we're reporting to you with these data. Very interesting. The control group said the traditional clinical environment was the best met their learning needs. The 50% group said simulation best met their learning needs. And the 25% group was kind of undecided between both. So it definitely shows that students can adapt to the methods in which they're taught. Research question number 3, are there differences in the first-time NCLEX pass rates between students that were randomized into a control group, 25% and 50% of traditional clinical substituted with simulation? Here are their NCLEX pass rates. Every one of the groups had an average pass rate that was higher than the national pass rate, and there was no statistical difference among the three groups. And I don't know if you were noting the clinical scores, the clinical ratings by the preceptors, but every one of those students the mean scores were extremely high for all of them. So then we decided we were going to follow these students into their first 6 months of practice to see if we could ascertain or discern any differences there when they went into practice. We did follow-up questionnaires at 6 weeks, 3 months, and 6 months of not only the new graduate nurses, but of their supervisors. The response rate, 575 students agreed to be contacted for follow-up surveys. So about 86.3% of the students that completed the study, and 379 new graduates, almost 66%, actually provided their start date information. So the students were told that when they started their new first job, when they got their first job, to notify our study team at NCSBN with their start date and information such as contact information so we could send them the follow-up questionnaires. And the new graduate nurses were sent questionnaires that they had to fill out, and then a questionnaire they were supposed to give their supervisor for them to fill out. 355 completed at least one follow-up survey. Now, we want you to keep in mind when you look at these data that these students were practicing in a variety of institutions all over the country. People that they had supervisors that knew nothing about the study or really knew nothing about any of they were given some information, but there was a huge amount of variability in the settings that these students were in. So, to remind you, this portion of the study, their research question was, our research question was, are there differences in clinical competency, critical thinking, and readiness for practice among the new graduate nurses from the 3 study groups? I'm going to only report to you the 6-month manager ratings because it's the same, you will see the same trend if you looked at the 3-week and the 3-month data. If you look at the new graduate nurse performance surveys on a 1 to 6 scale, the supervisors were asked to rate the new graduates on various elements there, and you will note that they all received from their supervisors ratings over 5.0, mean ratings over 5.0, and again, there was no statistically significant difference among the groups, among the students who had been in the 3 groups. In critical thinking, their 6-month manager ratings, there was no statistical difference among the groups. Their overall clinical competency ratings at 6 months by their managers, and this was the global assessment of clinical competency and readiness for practice, same as they were rated in their last clinical setting. Their overall ratings were all over 8, and there was no statistical significant difference. Students were doing as well in practice as they were in school. Research question number 2 was, are there differences among new graduates from the 3 study groups in acclimation to the role of the professional nurse? So we asked them how well they felt they were prepared to enter practice. Interesting, at the 6-week survey, the 50% group said they felt the most prepared, and that was statistically significant. But by 6 months, all 3 groups were equivalent, and there was no statistical difference among them. We looked at who might have left their first nursing position in the first 6 months, and there, even though the 50% group had slightly higher, there was no statistical significance. Patient care assignments. We asked them to rate their patient care assignment, whether it was too challenging, just right, or not challenging enough. And again, the students, all 3 groups were almost exact. About 83 to 84% said that their clinical patient care assignments were just right at 6 months. We asked them to answer the question about whether they were experiencing stress at work. And these are the data from 6 weeks, 3 months, and 6 months. The green set agrees with the statement, I am experiencing stress at work. And you will note that the stress goes up a little bit at 6 months, and you will note that this is in the literature as well. That's when they're becoming more independent. They get a little bit more difficult assignments. But again, there was no difference between these groups at the 3, 6, or 6 week, 3 months, or 6 months measurements. And finally, the last question. We asked them to answer the question, to agree or disagree. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm giving you the wrong information. The question was, in the last week, I felt expectations of me were unrealistic, and they were asked to answer almost never, which was blue, sometimes, which was red, green was often, and then the purple was almost always. And you will see the majority of these students said almost never I felt the expectations of me were unrealistic. want to discuss the limitations of the study. Every study has them, and certainly we want to discuss what the limitations of this study were. First of all, the participating schools were not randomly selected. They volunteered for it, and we selected them on the criteria, and also we wanted a geographically diverse sample. So we selected schools, but we had no other information than what we asked for as the study criteria. But we do acknowledge that these schools probably had an interest in simulation and exploring it, and they were probably pretty visionary and risk-taking schools. Only one method of conducting simulations were used in this study. We, of course, wanted to do that to keep it very constant and controlled, but there are various methods of using simulation. And the quality of the clinical experiences were not assessed. However, given our results and how comparable they were to simulation, we would expect that they were of high quality and pretty equivalent to the type of simulation experiences that the students were receiving. Now, this is a limitation that always comes up in the discussion, and people say, you know what, your end-of-program preceptors and nurse managers were not blinded to the study groups. But my response to that is those groups turn out so equal that if there were bias, it was equally distributed among all three groups. So I'm not sure I believe that that was a limitation of this study. And finally, the distribution of end-of-program and nurse manager surveys relied on the study participants to give them to the manager. So it is, very quite possible that students that were, or the new graduate nurses that were not doing well did not give the survey to the manager to fill out. Our conclusions. Up to 50% simulation can be effectively substituted for traditional clinical experience in all core courses across the pre-licensure nursing curriculum. 50% simulation can be effectively used in various program types in different geographic areas in urban and rural settings with good educational outcomes. NCLEX pass rates were unaffected by the substitution of simulation throughout the curriculum. All three groups were equally prepared for entry into practice as a new graduate nurse. And policy decisions regarding the use and amount of simulation in nursing needs to be dependent upon the utilization of best practices in simulation. So let me give you some qualifiers. These results were achieved not randomly, but by using the NASCL standards of best practice, high-quality simulations, a debriefing method that was grounded in educational theory, and trained and dedicated simulation faculty. Our recommendation for educators and regulators: if you are going to do this, you need formally trained faculty in simulation pedagogy. You need to use theory-based debriefing methods. You need an adequate number of simulation faculty that is well-trained to support the learners. And you need equipment and supplies to create a realistic environment. I would like to end with the final two sentences in the report of the study. The most significant finding of this study is the effectiveness of two types of educational methods: traditional clinical and simulation experience, when structure and adequately prepared faculty with appropriate resources, dedication, foresight, and vision are incorporated into the pre-licensure nursing program, excellent student outcomes are achieved. If you'd like a report of this study, you can download it from the Journal of Nursing Regulation site, www.journalofnursingregulation.com. It is free to download if you would like a report, a written report, copy of it, you can order one over the website. Thank you for having me here today. And are there any questions? Oh. Okay. Any questions?
Hello.
Come to the mics.
Please come to the mics if you have a question.
Hi, I have a question over here in the center. A lot of schools actually do an evaluation of either assigning a grade or a pass-fail when they're looking at their clinicals. And I saw that you had an evaluation form that was specific for simulation. Do you know if there was any responses from the school in particular, how they were actually, when they were in the clinical site, the actual site, how they used an evaluation tool, and what did they do with the two of those tools to then come up with either a passing grade for the student, or did they have two sets of passing grades, or do you have any information on that?
I do not know how they graded the students. They did not tell us any information about that. All they, just sent us the data that we were requesting, the forms that we requested them to fill out.
Here we are, Mary Ann.
Yes, two questions. One, you talk about the percentage, but can you tell us about the total number of hours in clinical, of which 50, 25, or 10% were transitioned into simulation? And then any feedback from the faculty on how difficult or easy or comfortable it was to make the transition to 50% of simulation as opposed to clinical?
The school did the 25-50% according to the number of hours they had at their own school. So we did not require a certain number of clinical hours. Whatever the school traditionally did, that was what they broke up and divided up into the simulation and clinical hours. I did not, I was not the principal investigator, but I did not hear of much feedback from faculty. I do think that, our training them really assisted them to get into the mode of it, but I'm sure there were challenges along the way.
Hi, I'm Marilyn Friend from Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I wonder, I know it was not part of your research questions, if you had any additional ideas in terms of the relative costs of the 25 and 50% simulation compared to the control, and the acceptability of the clinical agencies where the students were having their clinical practice. Did they have it like 1 week they would have clinical and then the next sim? Kind of two questions combined in one, but
right.
Sorry.
Quite all right. Economic, I would advise you all to see the upcoming issue of the Journal of Nursing Regulation. Our October issue, we're going to have an economic analysis of the simulation and of the study. Your other question, remind me again, it was, how the schools broke. I'm sorry, I can't see from up here, so if you're there and I'm looking there, please excuse me. The schools were allowed to break up the simulation and clinical however they wanted to do it. So if they wanted to do, for a 50% group, one day you'll go to the hospital, the next day you'll go to simulation, they could do that. If they wanted to say, you will spend 2 days this week in simulation and 2 days in the clinical area next week, they could do that. If they wanted to do half and half each day, it was up to them.
And did you have any feedback from the clinical agencies in terms of the combination? Were they okay with the students being there varying amounts of time, or did that present a problem? I don't know if you had data on that.
We do not have those data. Those would probably come from the schools would be more likely to have that information.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Doris Rink, and I teach simulation at Portland Community College in Portland, Oregon. And I noticed in the study all of the faculty were trained in simulation. Was there any consistency in the training of the clinical for the faculty that participated, so that the clinical, the way in which they conducted their clinical was similar, as opposed to being, different faculty teaching in quite a different manner? So was there...
We did not give any training for clinical. However, it was the same faculty. So if you were the clinical faculty in simulation for pediatrics, you were also the clinical faculty in the clinical site for pediatrics.
Okay, but there wasn't specific training so that all the faculty were in different sites were trained similarly?
We wanted the clinical to be traditional, as it always is.
Okay, thank you.
My name's Nancy Morton from the University of New Mexico. I'm here in the middle.
Thank you.
So, two quick questions. One is, were the hours counted 1 to 1, 1 to 2? In other words, 1 hour simulation for 1 hour of clinical?
Yes.
Okay. And what was counted as simulation time? Was the debriefing time counted? Was prep time counted?
Prep time was not counted, and it was the time that the students were actually doing some type of hands-on or observation of a simulation. Now, sometimes some students, while some were actually going through a scenario, some may have been on a computer working through some type of an interactive, web-based scenarios or that, but they were one-on-one, and it was actually the time that they were involved or observing simulation.
I'm Kristen Priddy, University of Texas at Arlington. I'm to your right.
Thank you.
I recognize, as you pointed out, that there were no statistically significant differences between the groups, but it sure looked like on a lot of the measures that the lowest performing group was the 25% group. So is there any thought that there's a dose-dependent amount of simulation, or in other words, does it look as though we need to have a pretty significant percentage of clinical time be in simulation for it to be really effective? And then a follow-up question is, what follow-up studies would you like to see?
To answer your first question, I don't think so. I don't think we have enough evidence to say that it has to be 50% or none. And those scores were really, really close. So I don't think we have any evidence there to make that assumption. Next steps, I can tell you for NCSBN, this is it. We're moving on. But, I think there's a lot of things that can still be done. For instance, we only used a certain type of simulation. We used the NLN, Jeffries framework. There are other frameworks, other ways that this can be set up and tested. But, we did kind of cover a big waterfront here with what can be done. But, we would be anxious to see people build on it and, advance, and do more studies based on our results and what else can be done and the questions that still remain.
So my name is Pat Reedy, and I am the ADM Program Director at the College of Southern Nevada. And I'm up at the mic to share our anecdotal experience and address the question that I was asked maybe 5 or 6 questions ago about the faculty and their experience with adjusting to simulation, if I can. So anecdotally, as you would expect, there was a lot of resistance initially, and a lot of education was required and a lot of insistence that things be done according to the study protocol. But as we went along and saw how the results we saw our students not being, there are no differences, just observing our own students. The faculty became much more confident and accepting of the simulation method. But there was that initial resistance to change as we would expect.
Thank you very much. Anyone else?
I just wanted to, I'm Alice Farmer from Ivy Tech Community College, Indianapolis, and we were lucky enough to be one of the participants in the study, and I was blessed to have a 50% group. And I just want to say that it was really, truly a wonderful opportunity. We enjoyed it. The students in the 50% group, I can say, they were just a delight to work with. And I just wanted to say thank you for conducting the study and allowing us to participate, because it was very enjoyable. We really, truly, truly enjoyed that experience.
Thank you very much. And thanks for your participation. And my editorial coming up in the October issue of the journal is about how wonderful the schools and the students were in this study. Yes.
Hi, I'm Maureen Tremmel. I'm from Seminole State College. It's near Orlando, Florida. And I also would like to thank you very much for this study, because in the state of Florida, our legislatures just passed a law that we may use up to 50% of simulation for undergraduate nurses. And my question to you is, what is the feedback or the feelings you're getting from the other state boards of nursing across the U.S. and our hospital partners about what is going to be the reaction to the results of this study?
Well, we presented it at our annual delegate assembly to the regulators from around the country, and the study was very well received. We are now putting together a small policy group that will develop policy recommendations for the use of simulation, and it will be specifically for boards of nursing.
I'm Ashley Franklin from Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, Texas. I'm way over here.
Thank you.
I have two questions about the research protocol. One of them is if the simulation facilitators and faculty from individual campuses had a refresher on their training over the course of data collection, or if you followed inter-rater reliability at all that way. And my second question relates to measurement. And I was a little concerned about the potential for halo effects with all of the tools that were used, since the scores were so high. So I wondered if you would comment on the range of scores, if you were familiar with those.
We did not give them any extra training midway through the study. The second question about a halo effect. You know, yes, certainly there could be. But, you know, I think that it could be a little misleading to attribute it to that, because don't forget, the halo effect would have lasted over, not only over 2 years, it would have lasted into practice. And I do think it maybe underestimates the dedication, the faculty, the preparation, and everything that these schools went through in order to carry out the study. So could it be? Absolutely. But, you know, I don't think you should underestimate what preparation and vision and all the resources and everything these schools had and put into the study to really help the students excel.
Marianne, we have 2 more questions and then we'll be done.
Okay.
I'm Carol Durham. I'm in the center. I'm the president of NACSL, and I want to say, Marianne, to you and the National Council of State Boards of Nursing, we really appreciate your vision, the ability to do this work and do it so exceptionally well. And it is really important. It's going to be a sentinel study for us in our community of simulation, and we're grateful. And I'd like to say that people who are interested in the standards that you actually have in your recommendation, they are a free download from our website of inaxl.org, INASCSL. And the other thing is also I would like to invite people who are interested in simulation education to become a part of our community of practice, because that is what we're about with INAXL. But again, thank you for your vision and your due diligence in doing this amazing study.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm your last question, and I'm over here to your left.
To my left.
Right, I'm sorry, to your right. I turned you
I was
around.
gonna say,
I turned you around.
and I think you're invisible.
And again, thank you for an intriguing presentation. You know that, I'm sorry, I'm Rumay Alexander, and I am from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. One of the core values of the NLN is diversity, and you had geographical diversity. I wondered if any of the institutions that participated were HBCU institutions or Hispanic serving institutions. And do you think that would have made any difference?
I do know that the school in Florida, Florida International, had a high Hispanic population of students. And if you look in the report, it will give you exactly the ethnic breakdown of the students.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Well, again, thank you very much for having me, and you've been a great audience, and it's been a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Mary.
You're welcome.
Well, don't leave me yet. I want to thank Mary Ann again. What a powerful presentation and a rich discussion. All of us in the nursing education community are grateful to the National Council for funding this study, one of the largest national multi-site longitudinal studies of a teaching strategy and its use in pre-licensure nursing programs throughout the country. Bravo, National Council. And Mary Ann, thank you for your leadership, and please send Jennifer our best regards. I also want to thank you, the audience, for your thought-provoking questions that you raised and for your engagement. For those of you whose questions may not have been answered, again, there will be another opportunity at the National Faculty Meeting tomorrow. In closing, certainly the National Council's research findings create both an opportunity and challenges for us in nursing education. As the conclusion section of the report says, achieving excellent student outcomes depends on prepared and equipped faculty. So we're in this futuristic area of teaching with the ever-evolving world of simulation technology. And I can almost hear you thinking, yes, it sounds great, but implementing it is easier said than done. Well, here's where that daring ingenuity from the NLN kicks in. Do you love that segue? Help is on the way. The NLN, with partners Laerdal Medical and Walters Kluwer Health, are always on the lookout for ways to help you and your colleagues. So we're creating a range of resources to make integrating simulation into your curricula easier. And you'll hear more about this in the weeks and months to come. So get ready. Have a wonderful evening, and I will see you tomorrow morning at the National Faculty Meeting at 9:45. Good night.